The gun was pressed against Ira Sawyer's temple when Maggie Covington finally understood the depth of the betrayal. She stood in the doorway of the Dusty Creek Sheriff's Office, her dress torn at the shoulder, her dark hair wild from the ride across 3 miles of open plain. The lantern light inside threw amber shadows across the face of the man she thought she'd known, Deputy Clarence Holt, and the cold satisfaction in his eyes made her stomach drop like a stone into a deep well. "You set him up," she breathed. The words came out barely above a whisper, but in that airless room they landed like a thunderclap. "You planted the money. You told them Ira robbed the Laramie stage." Holt smiled, slow and ugly. "Smart woman. Shame you figured it out too late." Ira sat in the chair behind Holt, wrists bound to the armrests with rope. There was blood at his hairline and a bruise forming along his jaw, but his dark eyes, those steady, watchful eyes she had grown to love against every sensible warning her heart had issued, were locked on her. Not panicked. Focused. Like he was trying to tell her something she needed to hear without making a sound. "Put the gun down, Clarence," she said, and she was surprised by how steady her own voice came out, because there was nothing steady about her in that moment. There was only the sharp, terrible clarity of a woman who had run out of time and run out of choices, and who knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like winter cold, that the man tied to that chair was innocent, that the man holding the gun was guilty, and that if she did not do something in the next 30 seconds, Ira Sawyer was going to die for crimes he never committed. Holt cocked the hammer back. The sound of it was obscenely small in the quiet. Maggie reached into the fold of her riding coat and drew out the ledger. It stopped Holt cold. His smile faltered, and in that small crack of hesitation, she saw something that looked a great deal like fear. "I found your records," she said. "The real ones. Every payment from Aldous Greer, every stage you helped rob, every bribe you took over the last 4 years. It's all in there. Names, dates, dollar amounts." She held it up so the lantern light caught the pages. "And there are 2 copies. One is in my hand. The other is already on its way to the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne." The room went very still. And in that stillness, Maggie Covington thought about how she had arrived here, in this particular office, in this particular town, in this particular life, and how none of it had been anything close to what she had planned. It had started 8 months ago, in the spring of 1878, with a letter. Maggie had been 24 years old and living in a boarding house in St. Louis, Missouri, taking in mending work and giving piano lessons to the daughters of merchants who felt that music was a suitable ornament for girls who lacked interesting prospects. She had grown up on a small farm outside of Abilene, Kansas, with a father who worked himself to an early grave and a mother who followed him 2 winters later. After that, there had been an uncle in St. Louis, kind enough in his fashion but already stretched thin with his own family, and by the time Maggie was 22 she had quietly, deliberately made herself independent. She was not unhappy in St. Louis. She was also not particularly happy. There was a sameness to her days that wore on her in ways she found difficult to name. The same 4 streets, the same polite conversations, the same careful management of small resources, the same sense that the world was happening somewhere else to someone else, and that she was watching it all through glass. So when she saw the advertisement in the St. Louis Dispatch, a rancher in Wyoming Territory seeking a schoolteacher for the newly forming community of Dusty Creek, a position that included a small house, a modest salary, and the possibility of a permanent situation, she applied. Not because she was romantic about the frontier. She had grown up on a Kansas farm, and she knew very well that the frontier was dust and hard work and the occasional catastrophe. She applied because she was bored with her particular safety and brave enough, just barely, to admit it. She received a reply within 3 weeks. The letter came from a man named Aldous Greer, who signed himself as the primary landowner and leading citizen of Dusty Creek, Wyoming Territory. He wrote in a formal, slightly florid style that she found faintly suspicious but not alarming. He confirmed the position, outlined the terms, and added that the community of Dusty Creek was a growing and respectable settlement, that the schoolhouse was nearly finished, and that they expected her no later than the 1st of June. She packed 2 trunks and took the train as far as the rail went, then the stage the rest of the way. She arrived in Dusty Creek on a bright Tuesday morning in late May, road-weary and stiff from 2 days on a coach that had apparently been designed with the specific intention of making human beings as uncomfortable as possible. The town was smaller than the letter had led her to expect: a main street of perhaps 12 buildings, a livery, a saloon that was already busy at 9 in the morning, and a church that looked like someone had started it and then lost interest halfway through. Aldous Greer met her at the stage depot. He was a man in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered and expensively dressed for a frontier town, with the kind of smile that occupied only the lower half of his face while the eyes above it conducted a separate and less friendly transaction. He welcomed her warmly, showed her the schoolhouse, which was, to be fair, completed and reasonably well supplied, and introduced her to the small house behind it that was to be hers. "You'll find Dusty Creek a fine place, Miss Covington," he told her. "We value education here. We value the right kind of people." She was unpacking her trunks that afternoon when she first heard about Ira Sawyer, Mrs. Della Parks, who operated the town's only dry goods store and possessed what appeared to be a comprehensive file of information on every person within 30 miles, arrived on the pretext of welcoming the new schoolteacher with a basket of bread and jam, and within 20 minutes had provided Maggie with a thorough overview of the town's social landscape. Most of it washed over her pleasantly enough. Then Della mentioned the Sawyer Ranch. "North of town about 4 miles, Della said, settling her broad form into one of Maggie's 2 chairs with the practiced ease of a woman who made herself at home everywhere without apology. "Ira Sawyer runs it. Came out here 6 years ago from somewhere in Texas. Nobody knows the full story, which of course means everybody has a theory. Good land, good cattle operation. Pays his bills, doesn't cause trouble. But Greer doesn't like him, and when Greer doesn't like someone in Dusty Creek, that someone tends to have difficulties." "What kind of difficulties?" Maggie asked, because even then, before she had ever seen the man, something in the story snagged her attention. Della's expression did something complicated. "The kind that are hard to prove," she said finally. "Missing cattle, fences cut. Last winter someone poisoned his water supply, killed a dozen head before he found the source. Nothing was ever proved, nothing was ever paid for, and Deputy Holt files the reports and loses them." Maggie met Ira Sawyer 4 days after she arrived. She had walked out to the edge of town to look at the landscape. She was not sentimental about nature generally, but Wyoming Territory in late May was something that demanded to be looked at. All that enormous sky and the distant blue suggestion of mountains. And she had not been paying sufficient attention to where she was walking, which was how she came to step into a shallow creek gully that her skirt had hidden entirely from view and turn her ankle. She did not fall completely. She grabbed at a fence post and kept herself mostly upright, but the ankle was well and truly turned, and she was standing there in the gully cataloging her options, none of them particularly appealing, when she heard hoofbeats. The man who pulled up his horse and swung down in a single fluid motion was not what she would have constructed if asked to imagine a Wyoming rancher. He was taller than she expected, broad across the shoulders but not heavy, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had clearly spent considerable time in the sun. He had the kind of jaw that looked like it had been designed for stubbornness and eyes that were a shade of brown so dark they were nearly black, and when he looked at her, the expression in them was carefully, deliberately neutral in a way that she would come to understand was habitual for him. "You hurt?" he asked. "I turned my ankle," she said, with the precise dignity of a woman who was aware she was in an undignified position and intended to manage it with as much grace as possible. "I'll be fine momentarily." He looked at the gully, at her boot, at her general situation, and clearly arrived at a different conclusion than she had. Let me help you out of there." She opened her mouth to decline and then realized that the bank of the gully was steeper than it had looked going in, and that her ankle was making its opinions about weight-bearing quite clearly felt. She accepted his hand. He pulled her up with an efficiency that did not make her feel like she was being handled, which she appreciated. "Ira Sawyer," he said. "I have the ranch north of town. Maggie Covington. I'm the new school teacher." Something shifted in his expression, some small thing, quickly suppressed. "Greer brought you in. He offered the position. The town needed a teacher." He nodded, not commenting further, and then he helped her to a flat rock where she could sit and assess the ankle. It was sore but not seriously damaged. He waited without crowding her, looking out at the plain with that patient, watchful quality that she was already recognizing as characteristic of him. "Mrs. Parks tells me you've had difficulties with Mr. Greer," she said, because she was direct by nature and saw no reason to manage the conversation artificially. He looked at her then. Really looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than social convention strictly required. "Mrs. Parks tells everyone everything," he said. "Yes, there have been difficulties." "Do you know why he dislikes you?" A pause. "I know things about Aldous Greer that he'd prefer I didn't know," he said carefully. "That's generally enough." She wanted to ask what those things were. She could see that he was not going to tell her, not then, not after knowing her for approximately 7 minutes. But the way he said it, that careful, contained quality, the weight of something large kept deliberately quiet lodged in her memory and didn't leave. He helped her back to the edge of town, leading his horse and walking beside her at a pace that accommodated her ankle without making a production of it. They talked about inconsequential things, the schoolhouse, the children she'd be teaching, the weather. But there were several points in the conversation where she had the distinct sense of a much larger conversation running beneath the surface of the one they were actually having, and she found herself paying attention to both. He left her at the edge of the main street with a short nod and a "Good afternoon, Miss Covington," and rode north. She went home and made tea and sat at her small table and thought, with a clarity that she would have found alarming if she was the sort of person who was alarmed by her own interior landscape, that she wanted to talk to him again. The school opened the following Monday. 14 children, ranging from age 6 to 15, appeared with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Maggie threw herself into the work of it with the focus and competence that had characterized everything she had done since she was a girl, organizing the space, assessing what each child knew and what they needed, establishing the rhythms of a school day that were firm enough to create order but alive enough to hold interest. It was good work. She found she loved it more than she had anticipated, which she supposed said something about the limitations of giving piano lessons to merchants' daughters. Ira Sawyer came to town twice in those first 2 weeks, and each time their paths crossed briefly and awkwardly, as paths do when both parties are aware of them in a way that goes slightly beyond the merely social. He bought supplies at Della's store. He spoke with the farrier. Once she saw him in conversation with a man she later identified as a cattle buyer from Laramie, and the conversation looked tense, looked like something was being disputed. The third time she saw him, she was the one who went to find him. She had a student, a quiet, serious boy of 10 named Thomas, the youngest of 3 Sawyer Ranch hands' children who had not appeared at school for 3 days. When she asked the other children, they exchanged glances and said something about Thomas's father having trouble, and the school was not sure. She rode out to the ranch on a Saturday, having borrowed a horse from the livery. She had grown up riding, and had missed it more than she'd allowed herself to realize. The Sawyer Ranch surprised her. It was not the struggling, beaten-down operation she had half-imagined based on Della's account of Greer's harassment. It was well-organized, the fences maintained, the buildings solid. A man who worked this place worked it with genuine intention. Ira Sawyer came out of the barn when he heard her ride in. He looked at her and his expression did that thing again, that rapid adjustment, that careful neutrality, but this time she caught the moment just before it, and what she saw in the unguarded instant was surprise and something that might have been pleasure. "Miss Covington," he said. "Thomas Harker hasn't been in school," she said. "I wanted to make sure he was all right." He looked at her for a moment as if measuring the statement. "His father's in trouble," he said. "Greer is claiming Roy Harker owes him for water rights that Roy never agreed to buy. It's not a legal claim, there's nothing in writing, Roy never signed anything, but Greer has Holt, and Holt has the means to make Roy's life difficult. Is Roy at the ranch? Left yesterday to deal with it, left the children with my housekeeper. And Thomas, he's here, he's fine, ashamed, I think. Kids get ashamed when their fathers are in trouble, even when it's not the father's fault." She nodded. "Could I speak with him?" He studied her for a moment longer than she expected. Then he said, "Come in," and walked her to the house. The inside of the Sawyer Ranch house surprised her, though she could not immediately have said why. It was spare but not rough. There were books on a shelf, real books, not just an almanac and a Bible, but actual novels, and a couple of volumes that looked like they might be history. There was a table that was clean and well-made. There was a window with a good view of the mountains, and someone had clearly built the house with that window in deliberate position. Thomas was in the kitchen with Ira's housekeeper, an elderly Mexican woman named Señora Ramirez, who gave Maggie a look of frank assessment, and then appeared satisfied by what she found, because she left them alone and took Thomas through to sit with Miss Covington and Mr. Sawyer in the main room. Thomas was scared and trying not to show it. Maggie sat with him for half an hour and talked about school and about his work and about nothing in particular, because sometimes what scared children needed was not reassurance but the experience of normalcy. By the end of it, he was promising to come back Monday. When he had gone back to the kitchen, Maggie and Ira sat for a moment in silence, and it was the particular silence of two people who have just done something together and are sitting with how natural it felt. "Thank you for coming out," he said. "He's a good student, quick mind. His father's a good man." A pause. "Greer's going to push this. He's pushed it with 3 other families this year. 2 of them sold out and left." She looked at him directly. "And you're still here." "I'm still here. Because you know things about him," she said, echoing what he'd told her on the day they met. "What things?" He was quiet for a long moment, weighing something. Then he said, "Aldous Greer and Deputy Holt are running a robbery operation. They have been for 4 years. Greer picks the target stages, sometimes freight wagons, and Holt provides the inside information about schedules and payrolls. They use a crew of 3 men. The robbery money gets laundered through Greer's land dealings." She sat with that. "How do you know?" "Because I found one of the crew drunk in my barn 2 winters ago." He was scared and he talked. "I documented everything he told me. Then 2 weeks later he disappeared. I don't know if he's dead or if Greer bought him back, but he's gone, and without him I have documentation of claims I can't directly substantiate." He met her eyes. "I've been building a case slowly, looking for the ledgers. Greer keeps records, men like him always keep records because they don't trust the people they work with, and the records are leverage. If I find those records, I have something a federal marshal can act on. Have you tried going to the federal authorities without them?" 3 times. "Greer has friends in Cheyenne. The complaints disappear." He shook his head. "I need the ledger." She thought about Aldous Greer and his expensively florid letters and his lower half smile, and she felt a slow, cold anger begin to build in her chest. Where would he keep something like that? "I suspect his office, but I can't get into his office without justification." "I can," she said. He looked at her sharply. "He invited me to a dinner at his house next Friday," she said. "All the respectable members of the community, apparently. He does it quarterly. I have reason to go, and while I'm there I have reason to wander." "No," he said, flat and immediate. "If he catches you, you're in danger. Then I'll make sure he doesn't catch me. Miss Covington." Something in his voice changed, became more careful, more intent. "I've been working on this for 2 years. I don't need you to take risks. You might not need me to, but you might need the ledger, and I can get it more safely than you can." She held his gaze. "And please call me Maggie. Miss Covington. under these particular circumstances is somewhat formal. He held her gaze for a moment that was long enough that she was aware of it being long. Then something shifted in him, a small surrender of some kind of resistance. "Maggie," he said. "Ira," she replied. "She went to Greer's dinner that Friday." It was a lavish affair by Dusty Creek standards. 12 guests, multiple courses, china that had been freighted all the way from Denver, and a Greer who was smoothly, comprehensively charming in ways that she now found repellent because she knew what they were covering. She waited until the conversation was at its most animated after dinner, when Greer was holding court in the parlor and the other guests were appropriately distracted. Then she excused herself to freshen up and took a wrong turn that was not a wrong turn at all. Greer's office was at the end of the hall, locked. She had anticipated this. She had spent 3 days practicing on the lock of her own back door, with a set of picks she had quietly acquired from a man at the livery who did not ask questions in exchange for a modest sum and her word that she was not planning anything criminal. She was not going to think too hard about the ethics of that particular distinction. The lock took her 4 minutes, which was 2 minutes more than she had hoped and 2 minutes less than she had feared. She slipped inside and lit the small candle she'd brought in her skirt pocket. The office was meticulous. Greer was organized in the way that men with secrets tend to be, every paper in its place, every drawer labeled. She went through them quickly and carefully, replacing everything exactly as she found it. She found the ledger in the 3rd drawer of his desk, in a false bottom beneath a sheaf of land deeds. She did not have time to read it there. She photographed the relevant pages in her mind as best she could, dates, names, numbers, and then she replaced the ledger in the false bottom, reset the drawer, locked the office behind her, and returned to the parlor. She told no one at the party that she had found it. The next morning she rode to the Sawyer Ranch. She told Ira everything, including the false bottom, including the key names and dates she had memorized. He listened without interrupting, and when she was finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You photographed it in your memory." "My mother used to say I had a camera mind," she said. "I remember things I read, exactly. Do you know what you just risked?" "I know what you've been risking for 2 years." She met his eyes. "I'm not a person who sees injustice and walks away from it. It's one of my less convenient characteristics." He looked at her in a way he had not quite looked at her before. Something in his expression had opened up, become less carefully neutral, and what was underneath the neutrality was something she recognized, because she felt it herself and had been naming it carefully and honestly for the past week. This is not simple interest, she had told herself the night before in her small house with her candle burning. This is not mere concern for a fellow decent person in a difficult situation. This is something else, something I have not felt before in quite this particular way, and I am going to have to decide what to do about it, he said. I need to get into that office myself, to get the actual ledger. I know, she said. And once I have it, I need to get it to the federal marshal in Cheyenne before Greer knows it's gone. I know that too. That gives me a window of maybe 3 days before the sheriff from the next county comes in for his monthly meeting with Greer and Holt, which is when they do a security review. If the ledger is missing by then, they'll know immediately. She nodded. So what do you need? He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, something that was part admiration and part concern, and part something else entirely. Something that she suspected he wasn't ready to look at directly any more than she was. I need a reason to be at Greer's house. A legitimate reason that gets me inside. They worked it out between them over the course of that morning, sitting at the table in the Sawyer Ranch house with cups of coffee that Senora Ramirez produced without being asked, with a directness and practicality that Maggie found she loved, that they could sit together and work through a problem, and the work of it was itself a kind of pleasure, a kind of closeness. The plan was this. Greer had been pressuring Ira to sell a northern section of his land for 3 years. Ira would send word that he was willing to discuss it. Greer would invite him to the house for a meeting. During the meeting, Maggie, who would arrive shortly after, ostensibly to bring papers for the school board that Greer chaired, would create enough of a distraction to allow Ira 2 or 3 minutes in the office while she occupied Greer in the parlor. It was not an elegant plan. It relied on several things working correctly and at least one or two things not going unexpectedly wrong, but it was what they had. If something goes wrong, Ira said, you walk out. Whatever happens, you walk out. You're a school teacher. You have reason to be there. Your cover is solid. And you, she said, my cover is slightly less solid if Greer finds me in his office. Then don't let him find you. The meeting was arranged for Wednesday afternoon. Ira rode to Greer's house, was received warmly, the warmth of a predator who thinks he has his prey where he wants it, and was shown into the parlor to discuss the land sale. At 20 minutes past 3, Maggie arrived with the school board papers, which were real papers that genuinely did need Greer's signature. She was deliberately nervous-looking, apologetic, a little scattered, none of which was natural to her, but all of which she had thought carefully about and could render convincingly. She needed Greer's attention, his slight contempt for a flustered woman, his pleasure at being the most competent person in the room. She got all of it. While she stumbled through the papers at one end of the parlor with a Greer who was simultaneously managing her and keeping half an eye on Ira, she watched from her peripheral vision as Ira excused himself to use the facilities, and did not, in fact, go to the facilities. He was back in 4 minutes. He caught her eye for just a moment as he returned to the parlor, and the look in his eyes told her he had it. She wrapped up her business with Greer, thanked him profusely, apologized for the interruption, and left. She rode slowly back toward town so as not to attract attention. Ira passed her on the road 10 minutes later, going the other direction toward town, but at a controlled pace, nothing suspicious about a man heading to town on a Wednesday afternoon. He caught up with her at the edge of the main street, matched his horse's pace to hers. "Got it," she said without looking at him. "Got it," he said. "Thank God," she said. He looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that was not about the ledger at all. "Maggie," he said, "when this is over." He stopped. She waited. "When this is over," he tried again, "I'd like to take you to dinner, not in any complicated context, just dinner." She kept her eyes on the road ahead because if she looked at him, she was going to say something that was more than he was asking for, and she had better manners than that. "I'd like that," she said. "Very much." That afternoon he sent word using a rider he trusted absolutely, a man named Calhoun who had worked for him since Texas, to the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne. He sent a detailed letter with enough specific information from the ledger to constitute the basis of a serious investigation, along with a request for a federal marshal to come to Dusty Creek at his earliest possible convenience. He kept the ledger itself locked in his strongbox, and then things went wrong. Greer discovered the ledger was missing that same evening, not during the security review as they had anticipated, but because he went to his office that night and checked his false bottom for reasons that remained unclear. The timing was bad luck, pure and simple, and Maggie had always known that bad luck was as reliable as good in the world. By the following morning, Greer had told Holt. By noon, Holt had built a case, a thin, fabricated but nominally plausible case, that pinned the robbery of the Laramie stage, which had occurred 6 weeks earlier, on Ira Sawyer. He had planted evidence, which Maggie only later learned he had been holding in reserve for exactly this kind of emergency. Money from the Laramie robbery, marked bills, hidden in Ira's barn. He arrested Ira that afternoon with 2 men backing him up. Ira did not fight it, which was the right call. Fighting an arrest with no witnesses would only make things worse. But Maggie, who heard about it from Thomas Harker's father Roy, who had seen it from the road, felt the bottom drop out of her world. She had exactly 2 facts working in her favor. The first was that Calhoun had already left for Cheyenne and could not be recalled. The second was that she had a camera mind, and she had photographed every page of that ledger in her memory the night she had found it in Greer's false bottom. She sat at her small table in the schoolhouse that night and wrote for 3 hours. Everything she remembered from the ledger. All of it. Dates and dollar amounts and names and routes. Every entry, reproduced as faithfully as her extraordinary memory could manage. She wrote 2 copies. Then she found Calhoun's brother, who had arrived in Dusty Creek 2 weeks prior to help with the spring drive, and she gave him 1 copy and sent him to Cheyenne by a different route than the one his brother had taken. Calhoun's brother did not ask a single question. He just took the papers, looked at her with a kind of appraising respect, and rode out into the dark. Then she took the 2nd copy and she went to the sheriff's office, which was where she was now, with the copy in her hand and Holt's gun still pointed at Ira's head and the balance of everything they had worked for tilting on the edge of this moment. "The federal marshal already has everything," she said. "You can kill him. You can kill me. It doesn't change what's already on its way to Cheyenne." She kept her voice level. She kept her eyes on Holt's face. "Or you can put the gun down and we can talk about what kind of deal a man in your position might be able to make when the marshal arrives." Holt was silent. His jaw was working. "Greer is going to run," she said. "That's what men like him do. When it's over, he'll be in Mexico or California and you'll be the one who stayed. Who do you think takes the fall?" Something moved across Holt's face, rage, and then calculation, and then, slowly, the kind of exhausted capitulation that a man arrives at when he's run out of alternatives. He lowered the gun. Maggie breathed. "Now untie him," she said. Holt moved to untie Ira's wrists, and when Ira was free he stood up from the chair, and Maggie saw the effort it took him to keep from moving too quickly, to keep from reacting to the pain from his injuries. He came toward her, and she had to concentrate very hard on not closing the distance herself, on maintaining composure for another 60 seconds. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a moment. "The copy for Cheyenne," he said. "Did you already send it?" "An hour ago." "And the one in your hand? A duplicate, insurance." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, very quietly so Holt couldn't hear, "You incredible woman." She felt something bloom in her chest that was warm and bright and slightly overwhelming. She managed to keep her face reasonably composed. They locked Holt in his own cell with his own key. It was, Maggie thought, an outcome with a certain tidiness to it. The federal marshal from Cheyenne arrived 4 days later, a sharp-eyed man named Delaney who had the efficient manner of someone who had learned not to waste time or words. He had Calhoun's letter, and, via a telegraph exchange with Calhoun's brother, Maggie's transcription. He spent 1 day reviewing both, spoke to Ira at length, spoke to Maggie for 2 hours and seemed deeply impressed with both her recollection and her composure, and then went to arrest Aldous Greer. Greer had not, in fact, run. He had apparently decided to brazen it out, which Marshal Delaney described as a significant miscalculation. The arrest was quiet and efficient, which Maggie thought was somehow worse than the dramatic version would have been. There was no public reckoning, just a large, expensively dressed man being walked to a horse in handcuffs while the town watched from doorways. Holt had already, in the interim, provided a signed confession in exchange for a reduced charge. He had, as Maggie predicted, decided that cooperation was better than the alternative once he understood that Greer was not coming to save him. Ira came to find her the evening after Greer's arrest. He knocked at the door of the schoolhouse, and she opened it, and they stood looking at each other for a moment in the yellow light of the evening. "It's over," he said. "I know." He was quiet a moment. He had cleaned up since the night in the sheriff's office. The cut at his hairline had been tended to. The bruise along his jaw was fading to yellow at the edges. He looked tired in a way that she thought was the real kind of tired, the bone-deep releasing of something that had been carried too long. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the dinner I promised you." "So have I," she said. He smiled then, and it was the first time she had seen him smile without reserve, without that careful management of expression, and it changed his face entirely, made him look younger and less wary, made him look like someone who had been allowed, finally, to set down a very heavy thing. "May I take you to dinner tomorrow?" There's not a great deal in the way of elegant dining in Dusty Creek, but the hotel does a reasonable service on Saturday evenings. I would like that very much, she said. The hotel was, as he had warned her, not elegant, but the proprietress had made an effort with the table, and someone had put wildflowers in a small vase, and the food was plain but good, and they talked for 3 hours without any of the constraints or urgencies that had characterized every previous conversation they had had. She learned things about him that she had not known. That he had grown up in San Antonio, the son of a carpenter, and had come to Wyoming Territory with a partner who had died in the first winter and left Ira with a half-built ranch, and the choice of seeing it through or going home. He had seen it through. That he had taught himself to read law books in the evenings because he'd understood early that the men who controlled things used legal language as a weapon against the people who didn't know it. That he had a brother in Austin he wrote to once a month and had not seen in 4 years. That the books on his shelf had been freighted out at considerable inconvenience and expense because he considered them essential rather than luxurious. She told him things in return, about her parents and the Kansas farm, about the uncle in St. Louis and the mending work and the piano lessons, and the slow, crystallizing understanding that safety without movement was its own kind of dying. About the letter in the St. Louis Dispatch and the calculation she had made, that the risk of staying was larger than the risk of going. You didn't know anything about this situation when you came, he said. No. You might have come here and it might have been exactly what it advertised itself as. Yes, and you still came. I still came, she agreed. She looked at him across the small table with the wildflowers and the plain food. I think I would make the same choice again, even knowing. He looked at her steadily with those dark eyes that were so much warmer now, so much less defended. Even knowing all of it, the risk, the situation, everything. Even knowing all of it. She smiled, possibly especially knowing. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was a deliberate gesture, unhurried, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a while with the evening light coming through the hotel window and the sounds of Dusty Creek going about its Saturday outside. In the weeks that followed, the town rearranged itself around the new reality. Greer's land holdings were subject to legal proceedings. Some of the families he had driven out sent letters inquiring about return. The families that remained, the Harkers, and the Pullmans, and the Delgados who ran the livery seemed to stand a little straighter, to move through their days with less of the particular tension that comes from living in a place where power is held by someone who wishes you ill. Maggie kept teaching. The school grew. 2 more families arrived in July, drawn by word that Dusty Creek was no longer under the thumb of the man who had kept it small and frightened. She had 21 students by August, which meant the schoolhouse was crowded, and she submitted a detailed and well-argued proposal to the newly formed proper town council for an expansion. The town council approved it in one session, which Della Parks told her was unprecedented. Ira came to town more often, and not always for supplies. He came to the school sometimes at the end of the day, arriving when the children were leaving, and helped her stack books and straighten chairs, and they talked while they did it, easily and naturally, the way people talk when they have established a shared language and a shared rhythm. Sometimes he stayed for dinner at the boarding house where she now took meals, since Mrs. Foster, who ran it, was a better cook than she herself was, and the company was lively. The other boarders treated them with a sort of affectionate conspiracy, clearing off to other parts of the house after dinner with transparent but well-intentioned excuses, leaving them the parlor. He kissed her for the first time on a Tuesday evening in late July, on the porch of the boarding house after dinner, in the golden summer dark. He was going to leave, had his hat in his hand, and she had been standing on the porch watching the stars come out over the mountains, and he had turned back and said her name, and when she turned, he was close enough that the choice was entirely obvious. It was a careful kiss because he was a careful man, unhurried and certain, neither tentative nor presumptuous, warm in exactly the right proportion. When it ended, she stood there looking at him in the dark and thinking that she had been correct about what she felt, that it was not something she had misread or overinterpreted. "I've been wanting to do that for about 2 months," he said. "Longer than that," she said. He looked at her. "How much longer?" "Since the day you helped me out of the creek gully," she said. "Not immediately, but within the day." He made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. She had not heard him laugh yet, not quite, and this was the nearest approach, and said, "I built a case against that impression for 3 weeks before I stopped bothering." "What one?" she asked. "Everything about you," he said simply. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the one that had worn a bruise for a week after Holt's men had hit him, which was healed now and warm under her hand, and she felt him close his eyes briefly and lean into it with a trust that moved her more than anything else had. "Come to the ranch on Saturday," he said. "Señora Ramirez will cook. Bring nothing, do nothing, just come." "All right," she said. She came. She came the following Saturday and the one after that, and the ranch became a place she knew in the same way she was beginning to know him, deeply and incrementally, each visit adding something new. The way the morning light came off the mountains to the north, the name of every horse in the barn, the particular ease with which Señora Ramirez spoke to her in a mixture of Spanish and English that Maggie worked to understand, and in doing so, improved her Spanish considerably. She met his ranch hands, 3 men who had been with him since the early hard years and who treated him with the particular loyalty that is earned rather than commanded. She saw how he worked the ranch, the genuine care for the animals, the methodical approach to every problem, the way he listened to the men who worked for him as though their opinions were worth having, because he had clearly long since established that they were. She realized one October morning riding back to town after a Saturday at the ranch, not just in love with him. She was in love with the life she could see when she was with him, the specific, detailed, inhabitable life of it, the ranch and the horses and Señora Ramirez's cooking, and the evenings sitting on the porch watching the stars come out, and the sense, more and more, that this was the thing she had left sent Louis to find without knowing she was looking for it. He proposed to her in November on a Sunday afternoon after church, walking along the creek at the edge of town, not the gully she had fallen into, a different stretch, where the cottonwoods had gone yellow and the water was running clear and cold. He stopped walking and turned to face her and said, "I want you to marry me, Maggie. I want you to come live at the ranch. I want to build more of the house, it's too small, and it needs a study for you, and a proper kitchen, not just the Linta Señora Ramirez has been managing with for 6 years. I want you to keep the school if that's what you want, and I think it is, and that matters to me. I want to spend the rest of my life talking to you and working alongside you and knowing that when I ride in at the end of the day, you're there." He was not a flowery man. He never had been. But there was nothing in what he said that was not true and carefully meant, and she found that she valued that more than flowers. "Yes," she said. He reached for her and held her in a way that was certain and warm, and that felt simply like belonging. They were married in December, in the church that someone had started and lost interest in halfway through, but which had since been completed by community effort and properly dedicated. The Harkers came, and the Pullmans, and the Delgados and Della Parks, who cried throughout the entire ceremony in a way that was entirely incongruent with her general character and completely endearing. Señora Ramirez wore her best dress and sat in the front row, and when Maggie came down the makeshift aisle, she looked at Ira waiting there and thought, "There he is," and the simplicity of the thought was its own kind of magnificent. The reception was in the hotel, which Mrs. Foster had decorated with pine boughs and candles, and someone had procured a fiddle player and a second man who played a harmonica with surprising skill, and the dancing went on until well past midnight. Maggie danced with Ira until her feet hurt and then kept dancing because the evening was alive in a way she didn't want to let end. She moved to the ranch. The study was built in February by a carpenter from the next town over who did good work and asked no unnecessary questions. and it was just the right size and had a window that looked south toward town, and she put her books in it and her writing materials, and within a week it looked exactly like her mind on the inside, organized and inhabited and alive. The school continued. She rode into town 4 days a week, and Ira rode with her on the days when the ranch work allowed it, and on the days when it didn't she rode alone, which she was entirely capable of and which he understood and respected. They had agreed early, clearly, and without drama that her work was hers, and his work was his, and neither of them was interested in a marriage that required the diminishment of either person. That agreement, more than any other single thing, was what made the marriage extraordinary. In the spring, when the Wyoming Territory began its annual revival, all that impossible blue sky and the first green coming up on the hillsides and the air that smelled like cold water and new grass, she knew she was pregnant. She told him on a Thursday evening in April, sitting on the porch in the last of the day's light. He was very still for a moment, and then he turned to look at her, and his expression was something she had never seen on him before, completely unguarded, completely open, every barrier down, a kind of wondering joy that she thought he might not have known he was capable of feeling. He put his hand on her face, both hands, and he looked at her with that expression and said nothing for a moment because there was apparently nothing that needed saying. Then, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," she said, "a little tired, otherwise fine. Tell me what you need." "I don't need anything different yet," she said. "I'll tell you when I do." He nodded. He was practical that way, which she loved. He did not fuss. He was present and attentive without hovering, which was the exact right calibration. That summer she continued teaching until July, when the increasing visibility of her condition made her feel it was appropriate to hand the school to a young woman from the next town named Clara, who had been her assistant since spring, and was more than capable. Maggie did not leave the school so much as transfer it. She kept oversight, continued planning the curriculum, continued riding in twice a week to consult with Clara, who proved to be an excellent teacher in her own right. The baby was born in September, healthy and loud and thoroughly present from the first moment. A boy. They named him Samuel for no particular reason except that the name suited him when they saw his face. Samuel was a loud, curious, enthusiastic baby who grew into a loud, curious, enthusiastic child, and the Sawyer Ranch house expanded to accommodate him in all his occupations. First the cradle in the corner, then the small room they built off the kitchen, then the larger room when the ranch house had its second expansion in the spring of Samuel's second year. Senora Ramirez, who had been planning to retire to her daughter's home in Laramie, decided to stay for another few years, which she announced without preface one morning, and which Maggie suspected had everything to do with Samuel, whose company Senora Ramirez clearly found irresistible. The legal proceedings against Greer concluded 18 months after his arrest. He was convicted on multiple counts of robbery and conspiracy, and sentenced to 15 years at the federal penitentiary. Holt received a reduced sentence for his cooperation, 7 years, and left Dusty Creek in chains with an expression that Maggie, watching from the side of the road, thought was less remorse than exhaustion. The distinction mattered, but she did not dwell on it. Some things you close the door on because they require it. The land that Greer had accumulated through his various pressures and frauds was subject to complicated legal untangling that took another 2 years, but most of it was returned to its original holders or made available for proper purchase at fair prices. 2 of the families that had left returned. The town grew, slowly and steadily, the way towns grow when they are no longer under the control of a single man with a hidden motive. Dusty Creek got a proper sheriff in 1880, a deliberate and incorruptible man named Coles who had served with the Texas Rangers and had the kind of calm authority that meant he rarely needed to raise his voice. He and Ira established an immediate and solid mutual respect, the kind that exists between men who measure each other correctly on first meeting. Maggie reopened the school herself the following fall, When Samuel was old enough to come along and sit in the back of the classroom with a slate and the particular solemnity of a small child who takes everything seriously. She had 24 students that year, the largest group yet, and she submitted another proposal to the town council, this one for a proper two-room schoolhouse with a separate room for the older students. The council approved it again. She was developing a theory that the town council would approve anything she presented to them with sufficient detail and conviction, which Ira told her was almost certainly accurate and was a power she should use wisely. "I always use power wisely," she said. "You do," he agreed, without irony, in the tone of a man who had extensive evidence for the claim. The second pregnancy came in the winter of 1880. This time a girl, born in the following October with red in her hair that neither of them could account for and eyes that were going to be dark like her father's. They named her Frances, and she was quieter than Samuel but no less determined, which became apparent early and remained true throughout her childhood. Samuel, who was 3 when Frances arrived, received this development with a mixture of curiosity and territorial instinct that was entirely age-appropriate. Within a week he had decided she was his project. By the time she was old enough to follow him around the ranch, they were inseparable. The ranch expanded in 1881, when a neighboring property came up for sale properly and at fair price. And Ira bought the northern section and extended the cattle operation in a way that required taking on 2 additional hands and building a second bunkhouse. The work of it was substantial. He was out long days through the spring and summer and early fall, and Maggie, watching him from the porch in the evenings when he rode in dusty and tired, thought about how different he looked from the man she had first met, that carefully defended, watchful man with his controlled neutrality. He was not unwatchful now. He remained attentive, remained the man who read a room and noticed things that other people missed. But the defense was gone, or not gone precisely, but reoriented. The thing he protected now was not himself but the people he loved, which were her and Samuel and Frances and Senora Ramirez and his hands, and in a more diffuse but genuine way, the town that had become his community instead of just the place he had to manage. He told her one evening, late in 1881, that he had received a letter from his brother in Austin. The brother Jonas, younger than Ira by 3 years, was considering coming north. His wife had died the previous year, leaving him with a 4-year-old daughter, and he was finding Austin difficult in the way that places become difficult when they are full of the shape of something gone. "What do you think?" Ira asked. "I think if he wants to come, he should come," Maggie said. "I think you've been missing him for 4 years and he's had a terrible year, and it sounds like this town and this ranch could use what he has, if the letter is any indication." The letter was apparently a good indication, because Jonas Sawyer arrived in Dusty Creek in April of 1882, with his 4-year-old daughter Lucy and 2 horses and a trunk of tools, and he was clearly Ira's brother in the way that didn't need explaining: the same height, the same dark eyes, the same deliberate quality, though Jonas was warmer on the surface and quicker to laugh. Lucy was a serious, small-faced child who fixed on Maggie within the first day with an attention that was clearly going to become attachment, and did. Jonas worked the ranch alongside Ira and proved to be everything the ranch needed in a second capable man, steady and skilled, and not inclined to second-guess his brother's decisions, which might have been a source of friction but wasn't. Within 6 months, he was as much a part of the operation as if he'd been there from the beginning. And within 6 months, Jonas Sawyer and Clara, the schoolteacher, had begun a courtship that Dusty Creek watched with the same invested attention it brought to everything. And that ended, the following spring, in a wedding that was quieter than Ira and Maggie's but no less genuine. Maggie stood at Ira's side watching his brother marry the woman who had taken over her school, and she leaned her shoulder against his arm, and he put his arm around her, and she looked at the gathered faces of the people who had made this town what it was now. The Harkers and the Pullmans and the Delgados and Della Parks and Senora Ramirez, and Coles the sheriff and Calhoun and his brother, and all the rest, and she felt something that she might have called contentment. Except that the word was not quite large enough for what it was. "Are you happy?" Ira asked her very quietly. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her the way he always looked at her, that particular way that she had never found anywhere else, that specific quality of attention that made her feel known and valued down to the last true detail of herself, that was not comfortable in the easy sense but was safe in the deepest one. "Extraordinarily," she said. He pressed his lips to her temple briefly as the ceremony reached its conclusion. The years did not stay still after that. They moved forward with the particular velocity of a life that is being actively lived, seasons and celebrations and difficulties and recoveries, and the slow, steady accumulation of all the things that make a place and a life and a people real. Thomas Harker, who had been Maggie's quiet, serious 10-year-old in the first month of school, grew into a capable young man who studied law by correspondence and intended, when he turned 20, to go to Cheyenne to be admitted to the bar. He came to Maggie to review his correspondence lessons, and she reviewed them with the same rigor she would have applied to anything, and told him honestly when his arguments were weak and specifically how to strengthen them, and he went to Cheyenne with her thorough and unsentimental endorsement. He came back 2 years later, admitted to practice, and set up the first law office in Dusty Creek in a small building on the main street that had previously been a saddle repair shop. He was, by general agreement, excellent at his work and impossible to bribe, which in 1884 Wyoming Territory was still a distinction worth noting. Samuel, at 4 and 5 and 6, was everywhere on the ranch at once, following his father through the morning work, following Ira's hands through the afternoon work, following Jonah's when Ira and the hands were busy, presenting himself to Senora Ramirez at strategic intervals when he had determined that food was imminent. He was learning to ride seriously by 6, sitting up straight and paying attention with a focus that came directly from his mother and would never leave him. Frances was more interior. She had a corner of the study that Maggie had sectioned off with a small table and a chair the right size, and she spent long stretches of time there with paper and a pencil, producing drawings of horses and cattle and people and landscapes with a detail and accuracy that suggested she was seeing everything around her and recording it in ways the adults around her hadn't noticed. Maggie noticed. She made sure the pencils were always sharp. Maggie's own work expanded alongside the town's growth. The 2-room schoolhouse was finished in 1883, and the following year Clara, now Jonas's wife, and expecting their first child, suggested that the older students, who were now numerous enough to need it, should have an extended curriculum that would prepare them for possible further education. She and Maggie worked out the program together over a winter's worth of Thursday evenings at the Jonas Sawyer household, and it was everything that the town's children needed and more. When Dusty Creek got a telegraph office in 1884, the first message Maggie sent was to the St. Louis Dispatch. She was not sentimental about it. She simply thought that the paper that had run the advertisement that brought her here should know what had grown from it. She wrote a brief, precise account of the school and the town and what had been built, and included no unnecessary emotional commentary. The editor ran it as a short article. Della Parks framed a copy and put it on the wall of her store. In the fall of 1884, Maggie discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. She was 30 years old, which was not remarkable, and she told Ira in the study on a Sunday morning with the early light coming through the south-facing window and the mountains visible in the distance, and he looked at her with that same open, wondering expression he had worn each time, because it was apparently not something he grew accustomed to or less moved by. "A 3rd," he said. "A 3rd," she confirmed. "Are you fine? Good. Very well, in fact." She smiled at him. "Do not begin hovering. I will tell you clearly when I need something." "You always do," he said, which was true. The 3rd child was born in May, a warm and easy May that felt like the world making an effort. Another boy, they named him Daniel. for no particular reason except that the name had been in Maggie's mind for years, a spare name she'd been holding without knowing what for. Daniel was Samuel's coloring and Francis's temperament, which was a combination that produced a child who was quiet in the midst of everything, noticing and thinking and arriving at conclusions. He then shared at unexpected moments with a precision that was slightly alarming in a baby and became characteristic of the person he grew into. By 1885, the Sawyer Ranch was one of the most successful operations in that part of Wyoming Territory. Not the largest era had never sought to be the largest, which was a choice the men who sought to be largest rarely understood, but the most consistently managed, with the best-maintained land and the most loyal workforce and the clearest financial footing. Jonas ran the northern section with the same steadiness that characterized him in all things, and the two brothers worked together with the ease of men who have relearned each other after long separation, and found that what is fundamental does not change. Maggie had a school of 30 students by 1885, 2 teachers, a 3-room building, and a program of study that Thomas Harker told her was more rigorous than what he had encountered in his correspondence law courses, which she filed away as a compliment of a specific and satisfying kind. She had also, over those years, become a person of consequence in Dusty Creek in a way that she had not sought and did not perform but could not entirely avoid. She was on the town council from 1882 onward. She argued for the telegraph office and helped secure the funding for the road improvements in 1883. When a family arrived in 1884, a Mexican family, the Garcias, seeking land and work, and encountered the particular hostility that was common in frontier towns, it was Maggie who put the case plainly to the town council and to Coles the sheriff that the Garcias were to be treated as the community members they intended to become. The Garcias stayed. Their eldest son was in Maggie's school within a month and proved to be one of the quickest mathematical minds she had ever taught. She was not always successful in these efforts. There were injustices in Dusty Creek and in Wyoming Territory broadly that her arguments and her work could ameliorate but not eliminate, and she had learned to hold the tension between what she could do and what she could not without letting either the limitation paralyze her or the accomplishments make her complacent. Ira, watching this work, understood it and supported it in the specific way that mattered most, not by taking over or by standing back, but by standing beside her, attending the meetings that were relevant, adding his voice where his voice had weight, and trusting her judgment absolutely. There was an evening in 1885 in November, when the first real snow of the winter had fallen, and the ranch was quiet and Samuel and Francis and Daniel were all asleep, and the house was warm from the stove and Senora Ramirez had retired to her room, and it was just the two of them in the study, her with a stack of student papers and him with a letter from his brother in Austin. A different brother, not Jonas, one she had not met, and the lamp burning between them. He looked up from the letter and caught her looking at him, which she had been doing without quite realizing it. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just thinking that if someone had told me in St. Louis 7 years ago that this is where I would be, you would have believed them," he said. "I would have wanted to," she said. "I'm not sure I would have believed it was possible to want something this specifically." She looked around the study, the books and the papers and the window dark with snow outside and his face in the lamp light. "I think wanting something this specifically is something you arrive at. You can't want it before you've seen it." He set down the letter. He looked at her with that steady, specific attention. "What do you see?" he asked. "This," she said. "You, us, this life." He rose from his chair and came around the desk, and she turned her chair to face him, and he crouched in front of her so they were level, and he put his hands on either side of her face the way he had the night she told him she was pregnant with Samuel, that gesture of careful and complete attention. "I was an unhappy man when I came to Wyoming," he said. "I don't think I knew that. I thought I was just a man with a plan, a man with work to do, a man with a problem to solve. I didn't know I was also a man who was going to need someone to come crashing into a creek gully before he understood the difference between surviving and living. I didn't crash, she said. I stepped, carefully, into a gully that was hidden. You crashed, he said, and he was smiling, and the smile was the full, unguarded one that she still loved the way she had the first time she'd seen it. Into my life and everything that was arranged in it. She put her hands over his. Ira. What? I love you very much. I love you very much, he said. He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed like that for a moment in the warm lamplight with the snow falling outside and their children sleeping down the hall and the life they had built around them. Solid and real and deeply, irreversibly their own. The winter of 1885 passed with the particular quality that Wyoming winters have, long and cold and demanding, but also, on the right nights, beautiful in ways that Maggie had come to appreciate rather than merely endure. She had learned to love the snow, which she had not expected. There was something about the way it simplified the landscape, reduced everything to essentials, that she found clarifying. By the spring of 1886, Samuel was 7 and Francis 5 and Daniel almost 1, and the ranch was greening up in that extravagant Wyoming spring fashion, and Maggie was standing on the porch of the ranch house watching her son and daughter chase the new lambs across the east pasture, while Ira stood beside her with his morning coffee and his face tilted up to the sun. Roy Harker asked me yesterday if I'd be willing to take on a partnership in the new grazing association, he said. The ranchers in the next valley are forming it, better negotiating position with the buyers. Do you want to? I think it's a good idea. The individual operators in this part of the territory are too isolated from each other. A formal association changes the dynamic. Then do it, she said. You've always known when something makes structural sense, he smiled. You once told me you didn't think you needed anyone's opinion on anything. I didn't say that. You implied it. The day you told Holt to put down the gun. That was a different situation. She looked at him. That was a situation that required certainty, not collaboration. This is a situation that requires collaboration. And you know the difference. Usually, she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they watched the children in the pasture, and the mountains were blue and present in the distance, and the morning light was doing what morning light does in Wyoming, which is to take everything ordinary and make it briefly luminous. She was, she thought, not merely content. She was inhabited by her life, fully and without reservation. There was no glass between herself and the world. There was only the world, this particular morning, this particular man, these particular children, this particular and irreplaceable specific life. The association formed that summer. Ira served on its steering committee, which was the sort of role that suited him, structural, detail-oriented, requiring the kind of careful attention to both the individual interest and the collective good that had characterized everything he had done since she had known him. He was not a man who sought prominence, but he was a man who, when he engaged with something, engaged with it completely. Thomas Harker, now practicing law in his small office on the main street, became the association's legal counsel, which meant that the Sawyer Ranch and Harker's law office had a relationship that produced occasional Sunday dinners, where the conversation about water rights and grazing law went on until late in the evening and was, Maggie thought, among the most interesting conversations she had at that period of her life. The children grew. Samuel was riding competently by 8, helping with the lighter ranch work with a seriousness about it that Ira met with equal seriousness, never condescending to the boy's capability, but also never rushing the learning. Francis's drawings became something more than drawings. They became studies, careful and detailed representations of everything she saw, and at 10 she had filled 4 notebooks with them. Daniel was a walker by 1 and a talker by 18 months and was, by 2, producing observations that required adults to pause and consider their responses. In 1888, Jonas and Clara had their second child, a boy they named William and Lucy, Jonas's daughter from his first marriage, was now 10, and the quiet, serious child had grown into a quiet, serious girl who had a particular friendship with Frances that both sets of parents observed with the shared pleasure of people who understand that the friendships formed in childhood are sometimes the most important ones. The telegraph and the railroad's expanding reach were changing the territory, bringing news faster and making the isolation of the frontier less absolute. Maggie read the national newspapers that now arrived within a week of publication, and she followed with intense interest the progress of the women's suffrage movement, which Wyoming Territory had granted in 1869, a fact she had known before she came, and which had been, she admitted to herself, a small but real factor in her decision to apply for the position in the first place. She talked about this with Ira one evening about suffrage, about the ongoing fight in other states and territories, about the particular position that Wyoming occupied. "You voted in the territorial election last year," he said. "I did," she said. "And the year before. Does it feel like it should?" he asked. Different from what you expected. She considered this seriously because he had asked it seriously. "It feels necessary in a way that the act itself doesn't quite capture," she said, "as if the importance of it is not in the individual vote but in the fact that the vote exists, that the exclusion has been refused." He nodded. "I think that's what justice tends to feel like," he said. "The importance is in the structure rather than the particular instance." "Spoken like a man who taught himself law books," she said. "Spoken like a man who married a woman who would have something to say about it if he didn't understand it," he replied. She laughed, and it was the laugh she reserved for him specifically, the unguarded, genuine one that she had, over the years of their marriage, stopped being surprised to find she possessed. The evening settled around them, warm and domestic, the sounds of the children in the other rooms and Senora Ramirez humming something in the kitchen and the cattle settling for the night in the pasture. And Maggie sat in the study she loved with the man she loved, and the life she had built was complete around her, everything resolved and present and hers. Samuel turned 10 in the fall of 1888, and the birthday produced a family gathering at the ranch house that included Jonas and Clara and their children and Lucy, and Roy Harker and his family, and Della Parks, who had been part of every significant occasion in Dusty Creek for the decade Maggie had been there, and showed no signs of reducing her presence in this regard. Thomas Harker came, now 20 and already the most trusted legal voice in 2 counties. Samuel blew out the candles on the cake Senora Ramirez had made with a gravity that was entirely his own, and then he looked at his father and said, "Papa, will you teach me to do the accounts this winter?" Ira looked at him for a moment with an expression that Maggie recognized, that open, wondering quality, the absence of his defenses. "Yes," he said, "this winter." Samuel nodded, satisfied, as though this had been a business discussion rather than a birthday moment, and reached for the cake. Frances, beside him, was already drawing him on her slate, the birthday boy mid-reach, expression of complete focus on the cake, and Daniel, 4 years old and utterly present as always, was watching his sister draw with the same focused attention. Maggie looked across the table at Ira. He was already looking at her. She smiled. He smiled back. Outside, the first hint of winter was in the air, that sharp, clarifying cold that preceded the first snow, that told you the year was turning, and the world was preparing for its annual rest and revival. The mountains were dusted with early white at their tops, and the sky above them was the particular deep blue that only occurred in Wyoming in the fall, a blue so precise and clean it seemed like a statement. Inside, the table was full of food and people, and the ordinary, extraordinary noise of a family gathered, and the lamp was lit, and the stove was warm, and Samuel was eating his birthday cake, and Frances was drawing, and Daniel was being picked up by Jonas's large and gentle hands and made to laugh, and Senora Ramirez was being pressed by Della Parks for the recipe for something she was determined not to give. And Roy Harker was telling Ira something about the northern grazing land with the focused enthusiasm of a man who has been given back what was taken from him and never stops knowing it. Maggie held all of it. She held it the way she held the pages of the ledger in her camera mind, faithfully and completely, with the specific awareness that this was the kind of moment that needed holding, not because it was unusual, but because it was perfectly ordinary in the way that only deeply lived lives produce, the ordinariness that is the product of years and work and love and choice, and a refusal to be driven away from what is right. She had come to Wyoming Territory on a risk, with 2 trunks and a brave heart and a camera mind, and the knowledge, grown up on a Kansas farm, that the frontier was not romantic but was real. And it had given her everything she had not known to ask for in a form she had not known to imagine. The man at the head of the table caught her eye again. "All right," he said, barely audible over the noise of the gathering. "Perfect," she said. He reached along the table and found her hand and held it, and the party went on around them, and the mountains stood blue and white beyond the window, and the ranch was solid under the first approach of winter, and everything, every thread of everything that had brought them here was closed and held and resolved and complete and theirs. Senora Ramirez eventually gave Della Parks the recipe, under conditions that both of them found satisfying. Thomas Harker stayed until nearly midnight, talking law and grazing rights with Ira and Roy, and left with the pleased expression of a young man who is doing exactly what he is supposed to be doing with his life. Jonas carried the sleepy William home across the dark field between the 2 sections of the ranch. Lucy and Francis exchanged a quiet, serious goodbye at the door. Samuel went to bed without being asked, which Maggie noted and privately considered one of the more remarkable developments of his 10th year. Daniel was already asleep, carried to bed by Ira an hour before, his small face utterly peaceful and his hands open on the pillow. When the house was quiet and the last lamp was turned low, Maggie and Ira stood for a moment in the kitchen, and the silence after a family gathering has the particular quality of a thing that has been full and is now resting like a field after harvest. "Good day," he said. "A very good day," she said. "Come to bed," he said, "before that cold comes through the walls." She turned down the lamp and followed him down the hall, past the doors of the children's rooms, past the study with its books and papers and the window looking south toward town, into the room that was theirs, which had been added to the house in the 2nd year of their marriage, and which had a window looking north toward the mountains, which was where she always woke first in the morning, looking at those mountains with the early light on them and the full extraordinary specific fact of her life alive around her. She had left St. Louis for a risk. She had found Dusty Creek and a school and a creek gully, and a dark-eyed careful man with law books on his shelf and a 6-year-old ranch, and a 2-year battle against a corrupt man with a hidden motive and a deputy with a gun. She had found a ledger and a false bottom and a camera mind, and a plan that worked on the right side of luck, and she had found love, which was the thing she had not been looking for and which had found her anyway, the way things find you when you stop protecting yourself from them. The mountains were dark outside the window. The snow would come tomorrow or the day after. The year was turning. Ira Sawyer put his arm around his wife in the dark, and Maggie Covington Sawyer, who had ridden 3 miles across an open plain to put herself between a good man and a gun, who had memorized a ledger by candlelight and sent it in 2 copies by 2 different routes to Cheyenne, who had taught 30 students and argued to a town council, and voted in 2 territorial elections, and raised 3 children who were already, in their separate ways, becoming remarkable people. Maggie closed her eyes and listened to the night settle around the ranch house, and felt the full, undiminished weight of a life that was hers, all of it earned, all of it built, all of it completely and irreversibly resolved.